Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Hollow Boy by Jonathan Stroud. Alrighty, so where do I want to start with this book? I actually had a lot of trouble getting into this book in the first 100 or so pages, but when I got near the end, towards the climax, I could not put it down. It was one of those moments that I was like, oh, I should have stopped reading hours ago, but I just kept reading until the end of the book. So this is the third in the Lockwood Co series, so as usual when I'm reviewing latter books in a series, expect there to be possible spoilers for earlier books in the series. I don't think there actually are that many spoilers in this particular review that I wrote, but just keep an eye out for them, be prepared. If you have not read book 1 or 2, The Whispering Skull and The Screaming Staircase, maybe read them before you watch this review, or at very least go back and watch my reviews of both of those books. But this book starts with Lockwood Co. still on the rise. They are a ghost hunting agency. They help get rid of all the violent, murderous ghosts in London. Lucy, our main character, is finally feeling settled in this job. She knows her compatriots trust and respect her, and she thinks they are working together like a well-oiled machine. Now, they are getting pretty consistent business, but it all tends to be small fry stuff. They are sent out after less than impressive ghosts, but also just a huge portion of their clientele are people who can't really pay well and are not exactly respected pillars of the community. And Lockwood, of course, wants his agency to be one of the most respected ghost removal agencies in London, and that means they need some big ticket jobs working for important people. Now, first, Lockwood hires an assistant for the company, Holly, and then the assistant gets them a job for a wealthy, connected woman. She can't find anyone else to hire because all the other bigger companies are working on one giant outbreak of paranormal activity, which has completely shut down the entire neighborhood of Chelsea. If this job goes well, hopefully Lockwood & Company will be invited to help on this outbreak too. Standing in their way is the fact that Lucy hates this new assistant, Holly. The talking skull in a jar just seems to be riling things up. Lucy's psychic abilities are growing, and maybe growing faster than she can control them. The inspector in charge of the Chelsea outbreak seems to absolutely hate them. There may or may not be someone trying to kill them. And, of course, there is basically an army of ghosts out there killing people. But if they get to the bottom of it, they might discover more about the very nature of these ghosts that are threatening the entire country of England. Okay, so now the thing about this book that I really feel like I have to talk about more than anything else is the contrast of how much I love the writing and really don't like most of the characters. Usually for me, if a POV character is not someone I can connect to, that kills a book immediately. But I love everything else about these books so much that even though Lucy sort of drives me mad, I want to buy the next book immediately. I want more of Lockwood & Company. So we'll start with why I'm not super fond of Lucy, and why I honestly dislike a good number of the characters in this book. So a person I follow on Threads recently has been posting a lot about how people tend to just be a lot less forgiving to unlikable female protagonists than they are to male characters. And this has made me hyper aware of the fact that, yeah, I do that. I tend to forgive male characters a lot more than I do female characters. And so it's made me really focus in on what I do and do not like in female characters and what annoys me to the point that makes me really dislike them. And God bless, Lucy just hits a lot of those points that I really don't like to see in any character. She is obsessed with physical appearances, and not in any kind of positive way. She's not vain about herself, being like, oh yes, I'm so gorgeous, which isn't good in its own right, but is a bit more tolerable to me than what she actually is, which is almost every character we meet she describes in unflattering and often downright grotesque terms. Take the introduction of Miss Wintergarden, the important client that they get. She was Miss Fiona Wintergarden, a tall, willowy, somewhat desiccated lady I judged in her early 50s. Her hair, cut short and sensibly, was appropriately rain cloud gray. She wore a cream twin set and long black skirt, and a pair of small golden spectacles on the crest of her angular nose. She sat perched on the lip of the sofa with her knees tight together and thin hands folded in her lap. Her spine was ramrod straight, her bony shoulders forced back against the fabric of her cardigan like the stumps of dragon wings. If she'd had a bust, it would certainly have been thrust forward. As it was, the effect was aggressively demure. And, like, objectively, that is a really strong description. It's very evocative. It gives us a lot about the character immediately. It tells us that we're going to dislike this woman a bit. Like, just the specific terminology of how we're describing her. The rain cloud gray hair. The stumps of dragon wings as the shoulders. The ramrod straight back. All of these just put us in mind of someone who is going to be exactly what this woman is. She is callous, she is classist, and dangerously stuck up. So in isolation, that description would have been gold, and I would have been like, oh my god, this is brilliant, this is so strong, and I would have just moved on from there. But the problem is, it's just one example of a too prevalent trend in this book. The only characters who are not described in unflattering physical terms, and also often described minutely, like there's a physical description almost every time they appear. The only ones that it does not happen to are Lockwood, who Lucy is clearly in love with, the director of the Fitz agency, who sort of reads as a dangerously gorgeous femme fatale kind of character, and Holly, who Lucy absolutely despises because Holly is everything Lucy sees herself as not being. And specifically, Holly is described as meticulous and attractive, and Lucy hates her for it. Which leads me to the second thing that I really find annoying about Lucy. She just hates all other girls. We really only have 3 young female characters in this book beyond our protagonist. There's Holly, who is too pretty and too put together for Lucy to tolerate the presence of. There's Flo, who is basically a homeless kid and is constantly covered in mud, smelling terrible, layered in horrible, shapeless, ruined clothing, and is super rude. And then we have another listener-type psychic girl named Kate Godwin, who Lucy consistently describes as cold, unfeeling, bitchy, and physically sharp. All the descriptions of her point out, like, the sharp chin, the pointy face. And, I mean, yeah, Lucy does also dislike most people, it seems, but the sheer amount of mean thoughts she has for other girls, it feels so much more than her meanness to anyone else, except maybe George, who she is consistently incredibly mean to. But at least with George, he tends to be equally mean back, and you can tell that the barbs don't actually affect him. He doesn't mind it as much, and so it's more tolerable, whereas a lot of the stuff with the girls just feels like girl-on-girl hate. And once again, in isolation, this is something that would not bother me. Having a random female teen character who is obsessed with physical appearances and hates other girls, especially those who seem more classically feminine and better put together and more attractive to male attention, like, that is a valid kind of character to have. There are girls and guys who have these faults, who will need to work through these hang-ups, and who might want to see themselves reflected in fictional characters. But what annoys me here is that this is not in isolation. It feels like every teenage girl character has these flaws. She's a teenage girl, so of course she's vain and shallow, obsessed with physical appearances. She's a teenage girl, so of course she hates all other girls, because they're competition. And I'm fucking tired of it. Now, the thing is, Lucy does have a lot of other flaws and other character traits that makes her stand out from just the classic cliche teen girl. She's pushy, she's too sure about her own abilities while also being incredibly in need of outward validation. She also is too determined to show off her own strength. She is utterly terrible at communication. Like, objectively, that is the next biggest flaw in her character. And she makes wild assumptions. And I love her for all those flaws. Like, they make her an interesting, real, very human character. Those are the kind of flaws that are perfect for this kind of growing up story. And we are seeing progress in like her growing out of some of these flaws. Like, she's getting better in a lot of them. And that makes it a really interesting, really evocative story. A story that feels like a coming-of-age story. It's good. I just wish so much of her storyline didn't revolve around, woe is me, I'm not as pretty as other girls, fuck them, I hate them because I'm not as pretty as them, I'm better than them because I don't care about appearances and I'm okay with getting dirty. And it's just, like, it's so much of it is the core of what 90% of stories about teen girl characters seems to be. And I just want to see other things. Now, on the other side of that, I feel like this book actually had a lot of positive growth for many of the other characters. Like I mentioned that I don't really like a lot of the other characters in this series. A lot of them are just mean-spirited. They're constantly fighting over nothing. They seem a little bit callous and not to really care that much on first appearance. But in this book, they start to get more progress as like being humanized. George in particular really starts to show some impressive empathy. Like, his friendship with Lucy in this book really evolves, and I really like where it's going. And Kate and Flo both get really humanizing moments. Kipps ends up showing a lot of depth and a lot of heart unexpectedly here. Like, we see a lot of his personality shining through the way that Lucy and the others see him. There's also an absolutely fabulous passage in here that I feel really epitomizes what Stroud is trying to do with a lot of these characters. There is nothing like the onset of night to bring out the best in an agent, and for some of us, the darker it is, the better. I am talking visually here. Suddenly, every embarrassing pimple is cloaked in shadows. Jaws become firmer, waistline sleeker, unwashed faces become pale and interesting. The lankest hair acquires a glamorous sheen. The rougher points of personality recede too. Thoughts turn to survival and to the job at hand. What I love about this is it's showing that as they go through danger together, they see each other's better traits. They see more past the mask of what they present to outward society. They become more human in each other's minds. And yeah, most of the characters are getting more likable as the series goes on. As they go through more shit together, they learn to appreciate each other's traits more, as is true in real life. So this is a really well mapped out, basically, key to what the story is doing. And I think the way the story is using this is really well done. And even like the traits that I dislike about Lucy improve as the story advances, as she gets into more trouble, as she deals with stuff. But that does mean you have to hang out with some people who are a little bit shitty in the beginning of the story. They're a bit mean. They're, like, snipping at each other a lot. They make rude comments. And sometimes they start physical fights with each other for pretty much no reason. And, like, that starting place of them being rather rough and coming together just makes the coming together matter more. But it means you start on a bit of a low when it comes to characterization. And so that is why it took me a while to get into this book. But what makes me keep picking up Jonathan Stroud books over and over again, even when I have disliked a lot of his characters. And I mean, the Bartimaeus series, I did not finish it, and I will not finish it because I hate the main character too much. But what I love about this author is his writing, his world building, and the pacing of his stories. This writing, in my opinion, is a masterclass in painting spooky, evocative images without going too far, without getting gruesome, and without leaning on the gross out. Because a lot of horror for younger audiences leans on the gross out as a way of having something, ooh, spooky, without, like, offending parents' sensibilities. And there are a few actual gross moments in here, but they're mostly just teenager grossness, like they're teenagers smelling bad, not cleaning, blowing their noses, and stuff like that. But the ghost descriptions, the spooky stuff, manages to really pull off the spooky vibe without having to do any of that. There's going to be death in a book about killer ghosts, but the death in these books it's just treated with just enough distance that it doesn't hit too hard for the age range it's targeted at. On that note, Jonathan Stroud's books, at least the ones I've read so far, have a through line of sometimes subtle and sometimes not at all subtle themes of class and wealth inequality. And this one does have it too. I will say in this one it's not as pervading, but it's still there. In the interview with Miss Wintergarden in particular, in everything touching on flow, in the treatment of the cases in the poor neighborhood versus the ones in the nice neighborhoods. And I suspect the overarching plot in this entire series, where we're driving to, because yes, we are driving from a more episodic series into a more overarching plot series, as they almost always do. And I suspect that the overarching plot here is going to be one of wealthy people being shitty, and it's going to be very in your face, I suspect. But this is just my suspicion because of the subtle hints already planted, not because I somehow magically know what happens in the next book without having read it. But there's also some beautiful work with the ongoing themes of adultifying children and the introduction of a more noted theme of adults resenting the power, the agency, and the maturity that they have thrust on the kids, that they are being forced to go out and fight ghosts. And it's cool, and I can't wait to see where the rest of the series goes with it next. It seems like it's a very interesting developing theme here. But that leads me into world building. And specifically what I loved in this book is the creature building. The ghosts in this book are just so perfectly creepy. We get just enough to give us a spooky vibes, and like the eponymous Hollow Boy is an image that is going to stick with me for quite a while. The same way the dancing monks stuck with me from book 1, which I did not think that image would stick with me, but I still have it pop into my head, and I read that book like a year ago. But also, I love the way the Hollow Boy is described as it's like perfectly creepy. It did remind me a little bit about like Celtic traditional fae monsters, but it's just different enough that it feels new and inventive and feels like a ghost story rather than a fairy story. But also the book just introduced a lot more different styles of ghosts and haunts in this book. Like we see a lot more physical description of the way they can present themselves, and it all is really well done and overall creates just general vibe for the book that feels like the right kind of haunted house that you might visit during Halloween. The one that just feels beautiful and spooky and evocative, but isn't grossing you out. And the plotting. Like I said, it took me a while to get into this book, but once I did, it was strongly plotted. This one, like all the others, starts with an action scene on a case that ends up being only tangentially connected to the main plot of the book, and then it transitions into calmer building action, and then the climax starts and it's almost full-on action until the very end. And like, I've made a couple of shorts about the fact that I absolutely despise the advice that is so often given to authors to start their book mid-action, always in the middle of a big action scene. And the reason I hate it is I think it's something that can be done right, but it's difficult to do right and really easy to get wrong. And if you get it wrong, you're starting your book off on a really confusing and disengaging start. Before you have exposition, before you have character building, before you have world building, you aren't going to have a reason to care about what happens to these characters in this action scene. It's a delicate art of giving readers just enough world building, backstory, and character intro mid-action to keep them engaged. And Stroud does it. And I think part of it is the way he plots out these action scenes. Each of the books starts with an isolated action moment, but there's just enough action to be like, yes, stuff is happening, and then we have a bit of a flashback to how we got into this action scene. And that gives us just enough world building and character building and reminders of what happened in the last book to know what is going on. But also, these action sequences that he starts a book with tend to be very short and very simple, straightforward action scenes. Like this book starts with the kids fighting basically a tentacle monster. And all you really need to know, well, first we start with literally just a paragraph explaining where they are in this moment. And then we get the flashback where we get all the information that you need to understand what's happening here. We get where they are, why they're in this attic, we get basically just enough of the character intro to know, like, Lockwood is debonair, George is a bit cowardly, Lucy is a listener. We get information like, oh, they use swords to fight the ghosts, the iron and chains can contain them, they need to throw a net over the source, and that's all we really need to know about the actual, to make the fight scene make sense. Because the fight scene is basically just swords fighting tentacles. And that's it. There's only three characters involved, plus a monster. There's not, like, a lot of complex weapons. There's not changes of scenery. They're basically in one small attic the entire time. Yes, there's a lot going on, but it's not the kind of action that you need to know every single thing that is happening in the different places. You can say, just George is swinging around the tentacles, Lockwood falls out the window, and that's all you really need to know to move that action plot forward. And so it works so perfectly. And it's after that that you can go back and learn all the information that makes this more nuanced. After the fact is when you learn, like, the complex different types of ghosts there are. You can learn about the fact that kids are the ones that have to fight them. You can learn about the fact that the world has majorly been altered by this effect. You can learn about the backstory of the different characters and what happened in the previous 2 books. And all that stuff is filled in later. But we get just enough in the beginning to understand why this action is happening and to care about why it's happening. So yes, if you are someone who wants to start your book with a big action sequence, I really suggest pick up one of Jonathan Stroud's Lockwood Company books to see how he does it, because he does it right. But the rest of the plotting is also just masterfully done. We get a lot of character building and dramatic emotional shifts in the rising action section, which is relatively calm. And once the climax starts, it's very fast-paced. Events happen one after another, and they all connect to each other perfectly. And it's the kind of writing you can't put it down because you need to know what's happening next. And there are ups and downs in the climactic action that keep it from feeling samey. Like, there's a beautiful transition from a high action, like, oh my god, shit's going on everywhere, it's hard to even track what's happening kind of action sequence, to a much more personal, emotional action moment, where a character is lost and trying to find their way back, and it's just so perfectly mapped. There are big emotional arc moments that happen perfectly timed in the crux of the action sequences, which gives them a lot more weight. And everyone gets their strong fighting moments, everyone gets their big emotional getting to know you moments, the relationship develops, it's all perfect. And the tension is managed so well that even though I know good and damn well all these characters survive this book, because I know there's at least one more in the series, I think there are like 3 more in the series, and like, I've read enough to know that some of the characters are going to survive, but the important thing is, even though I know it's highly unlikely that certain characters are going to die in this book, because they're in the name of the damn series, I still worried about the survival of them, and was still sitting there going, oh my god, could he actually die? Oh my god! And it's just overall a deeply enjoyable book, even though I didn't really like hanging out with Lucy for much of the book. And I loved the way the relationships between the main 3 protagonists have developed. There's a lot going on here, and it's the kind of stuff that's sort of hard to put your finger on because it's really subtly developing. Like, Lucy and George's sniping at each other in the first books really does feel mean-spirited, like they really detest each other. And in this book, they're still sniping at each other. But it feels like it's just playful banter. And it's really hard to put your finger on what changed, but something did change along there. And I love the growth we see in the characters, because, I mean, this is young adult. The characters are, I believe Lucy is 14, and Lockwood and George are like 15 or 16, and we can see them growing up. And it's done in such a way that it's not in your face, it's not them telling us, oh look, I have matured, but you can see it and feel it, and it's really cool. I also love the descriptive writing in this book. I think it's absolutely stunningly done. I love the story in this book. I want to read the next book immediately. And to me, that's just a sign of a really good book.